Well, let's discuss this with CNN national security analyst and former deputy director of national intelligence, Beth Sanner, and former spokesman for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Michael Bersacu. He was also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, both of you. Beth, let me start with you. So we have this failed ICBM test prior to the president's visit to Kyiv. Then we have President Putin yesterday announcing that he was going to suspend Russia's participation in the New START treaty. What does that suggest to you? Does that tell you that this is a more belligerent, more dangerous Putin, or does this suggest to you that he just has a weaker hand at this point?
Well, I think he's definitely trying to bluster and to show, to be threatening. There aren't very many tools in his toolkit, and these are two that he has used over time. Arms control, it's kind of a Russian play, even a Soviet play, and testing a weapon. But I think ultimately, while it is very worrisome in terms of long-term implications of the New START treaty and the ability to renegotiate that treaty before it expires in 2026, that's really important. But the implication, the on day-to-day implication is actually fairly minor.
Michael, President Biden reaffirmed the U.S.'s commitment to Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the collective defense. Attack on one is an attack on all. Do you think that a potential intentional attack on a NATO country from Putin is off the table? We talk about the accidental, what could happen unintentionally, but do you think this expansion beyond Ukraine now, considering the challenges he's having, that's off the table?
Yeah, good to be with you. Well, I think with Mr. Putin painted in a corner as he is right now, he will has the potential to reach for some very scary tactics. And I think the more likely scenario is that we could have another stray Russian missile as they've gone through Moldovan airspace. Some missile fragments have landed in Poland. Ukrainians claim a missile transited Romanian airspace. So I think it's possible that a missile could either transit NATO country airspace or actually land there. And that's when Article 5, I think, will be really tested. My prediction would be is they'll try and walk back the severity of something like that. And quickly on the nuclear front, I think Mr. Putin is continuing his con job of trying to blackmail the West with his nuclear weapons. With things like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So the West has to grow the spine. Western leaders have to grow the spine to stand up to Mr. Putin in this position.
Well, Beth, it appears that EU countries have failed to reach an agreement on a new set of sanctions that they would have introduced against Russia to coincide with the anniversary of its invasion of Ukraine. And this comes after, despite an unprecedented number of sanctions leveled against Russia, its economy has been rather resilient and clearly performed better than most had expected. I'm curious now with this new element of China potentially now contemplating helping Russia with lethal aid. How closely are they watching the fallout from this sanctions and saying maybe it won't be so bad if we have to endure them as well?
I think that the EU...
I'm sorry. Let's have Beth answer that, and then Michael, you can join in.
Yeah. Sorry about that. The EU rejection is probably temporary. I mean, this is something that happens regularly, that, you might have Hungary or one of the countries disagree. So it doesn't mean that these won't go through. Sometimes it takes multiple rounds for them to approve new sanctions. So it's not about them taking sanctions away, but, I think a hiccup in applying new sanctions. China knows, however, that it's going to be a lot more difficult for the U.S. and the European Union, the world, to apply sanctions against them because their economy is actually really, really important to us. And so it will be much, much harder, and they know that. And they're also building their economy and the resilience of their economy, isolating certain companies, et cetera, to avoid the implications of sanctions. So they're hardening their economy to protect themselves should it come to an invasion of Taiwan and the implications of the U.S. and others putting sanctions on them. So I do think that they are thinking about that, but they also see themselves as a very different test case than Russia.
Michael, you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, I agree with what our colleague said 100%. A couple of things here. I mean, one thing that the Chinese and the Russians were doing during COVID, when all of us were in lockdown, we're meeting very enthusiastically, and the Chinese helping the Russians to inoculate their economy against sanctions. That's number one. And number two is I think the Chinese are a little bit unsettled, if we can use that word, at the speed and the depth of which Western sanctions took hold once the full-scale invasion happened. And just quickly, when it comes to the EU, their unity on Ukraine is very impressive. What they're saying is very impressive, but I don't know how strong that will last as we go further into the invasion. For example, during the COVID pandemic, the EU couldn't even agree on trade and travel restrictions, things like that. So it shows that there are cracks in that unity, and this is something Mr. Putin, I think, realizes.
Michael, let me ask you about some domestic politics. You're in Worcester, there in Ohio, 80 miles west of East Palestine, of course, the site of that toxic trail derailment. We've heard from Nikki Haley, former UN ambassador, says that the president should be there instead of going to Europe. What are you hearing anecdotally there? I read something you told our producers about the reaction to the trip.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's a very Republican area where I am, by the way, but I think that a lot of folks here are actually supportive of U.S. assistance to Ukraine. However, I don't think that they expect Ukraine to be handed a blank check. And for sure, they don't want to see U.S. boots on the ground. So, and as far as the rumbling going on in the Republican Party, where they do have a fairly slim majority, is I think this is more a small group of people, but they could tilt things in a way that isn't favorable to Ukraine. Just quickly, having said all of that, I have to say I was absolutely touched last night when ordinary Ohioans came up to me and said, what more can we do for Ukraine? How can we help? Where can we donate? Can we take any more families in? So the kind of compassion that one finds here is very, very impressive, politics aside.
Yeah, context and perspective are certainly important. I thank you for bringing that to us. And we'll get more into the politics with our political panel that's coming up. Michael Barseque, Beth Sanner, thank you both.